Good afternoon, this beautiful day. We're competing with a really tough weather situation to bring everybody inside, but it's worth it. I'm Joanne Hart, co-chair of the Art at Watson Committee, along with Sarah Baldwin right here, other committee members, Veronica Ingram's here too. And I just have the pleasure to quickly get us started today by linking this panel to our art exhibition upstairs. It's titled Back to School, Emerson Prison Initiative Students Reflect on Unexpected Lessons. These are essays by currently and formerly incarcerated students that we've mounted upstairs on the second floor. And we'll have a reception today after this panel, and you can read the essays, and we'll see everybody up there. But I also want to note that right outside now are books for sale, and one is by Watson's own John Eason, who's written Big House on the Prairie, and the other one is Education Behind the Wall, and that's edited by some of the folks involved in our exhibition. I just want to say that if you're interested in those books, go now, because Brown Bookstore is going to close up, so they won't be here at the end of the panel, but they're on sale now. And at our opening panel for this exhibition, we had with us some Emerson Prison Initiative faculty and a couple of the students from this show. And one, Mac Hudson, is with us again today. He's out in the hallway right now, but you'll have a chance to meet one of the writers at the reception. He has come to join us. Lastly, I want to say that part of Art at Watson's goal for this exhibition on incarceration is to invite the academic policy discussion that's so important. And we're lucky to have some world-class experts here today to do just that. And I'm additionally happy to tell you that Watson's own executive director, Ed Steinfeld, is generously moderating our panel and will introduce the speakers. Thanks for your support. Over to you.
Thank you. Maybe I'll just I'll just stay right here at the table if that's all right. Thanks, Joanne. Thanks to the Art at Watson committee for making all this possible. It's really my pleasure and honor to be able to introduce two friends of mine and teachers of mine, really, on this topic. I'll try to be as brief as possible to give them the bulk of the time. But first, let me start with Adaner Usmani. Adaner is assistant professor of sociology and social studies at Harvard. He obtained his PhD in sociology from NYU in 2017, and then, as many of you know, from 2017 to 2019, Adaner was a postdoctoral fellow here at Watson, where he enriched our community with his knowledge and research and his teaching as well. Adaner's research is driven by questions about the distribution of flourishing and suffering in modern societies, and he's also very interested in as a lot of us recognize, the oft-fraught relationship between our normative commitments and our empirical work. Most of Adaner's work is on American mass incarceration. With John Clegg, he's working on a book that situates American punishment in comparative and historical context, and with Chris Lewis, Adaner's working on a book explaining what's wrong with mass incarceration if the standard story of its origins is false. John Eason is the Watson Family Associate Professor of Sociology and International and Public Affairs here at Brown. We welcome John as one of the newest members of our faculty here. John received his PhD in sociology from the University of Chicago. Before entering graduate school, John was a church-based community organizer focusing on housing and criminal justice issues, and he also served as a political organizer for then Illinois State Senator Barack Obama. John's research really develops new theories about the interaction between community and health and race and punishment, especially with respect to the U.S. South and poor communities in the U.S. South. His work really documents in very careful empirical detail the emergence of, I think, what we can call and what John calls the rural ghetto in the U.S. South. His absolutely extraordinary book, Big House on the Prairie, The Rise of the Rural Ghetto and Prison Proliferation, which Joanne had mentioned, it documents really the political economy of prison building in disadvantaged rural communities basically populated by marginalized American citizens, communities of African American citizens and Latinx Americans. Again, it's extraordinary work and extraordinarily illuminating work. I think we're all, I'm sure, going to enjoy the conversation that will ensue between Adana and John. But just to kick things off, I'm going to ask each one of them to present for a few minutes, and then we'll turn it over to conversation. Perfect. Adana, do you want to go ahead?
A few minutes? Is 20 minutes?
20 is fine.
20 is fine.
Perfect.
Okay,
15, 20 is fine.
Thank you.
I didn't mean to chop down on your time. What I may do, though, maybe we'll sit in the...
Great. Thank you very much, Ed. Thank you to everyone who helped organize, Joanne, Sarah, I'm sure everyone else who was involved. It's a real pleasure to be back. One reason it's a real pleasure to be back is because the Watson was home for so long, but another reason that it's a real pleasure to be back today for this panel is that I had the great honor of teaching the Emerson students whose work is being profiled last summer in a class at MCI Concord. And I have to say, I'd never been in a classroom like that one before. I'd never been in a classroom that was so serious about what it was doing in the class and what intellectual life was all about. I have to say, in recent years, I found myself a little dismayed at the climate inside college classrooms. Sometimes I feel like to walk into a college classroom can be to watch the universe close around you in some ways, just in the sense that I think despite all the resources and opportunities we have, a lot of us end up thinking mostly the same kinds of things about the world we inhabit. But my EPI class was just totally different from the get-go. They reminded me of the famous Gandhi quote, which was directed at his British captors. "You can chain me, you can torture me, you can even destroy me, but you will never imprison my mind." And I've been reflecting a little bit on what explains the difference between classroom at MCI Concord and classroom on a college campus. And I think in some ways the difference is quite simple. It's that for students inside prison, the stakes of the material that we were discussing, I was teaching a class on social theory, the stakes of the material that we were discussing was just so high. They wanted to understand the world that they lived in, why it was that a world that had given them so little had seen fit to punish them so harshly. And so in the effort to make sense of these questions, kind of posturing and image management, it just had no place at all. The learning they were doing was too important. It was about getting things right. And so it's in that's the kind of spirit that I'd like to channel for the talk today. I think it's there's no doubt that the premise of what the work that I've been doing for a little while is a normative premise, which is that I've always thought of it as a central epoch-making injustice that 2 million people in the United States languish in prisons in god-awful conditions on any given day. That's the assumed premise of all of my empirical work on the subject. But one common thread in that empirical work has been that the stories we tell about why we have mass incarceration in the United States are based on a number of misconceptions. Some of these misconceptions can be a little bit delicate to correct, but I think they're very important to correct, since you can't dismantle something if you don't understand it properly first. When I met Chris Lewis, who's the philosopher with whom I've written the stuff that's the subject of the talk I'm going to give, he noted something very simple about, is very, very straightforward about what I've just said, which is, he said that if you're correct about a lot of the empirical claims that you make about mass incarceration, they seem to have some important normative implications for that premise, which is that if your conventional story is wrong, and if our standard indictments of mass incarceration depend on that conventional story, then we have a question, which is what's wrong with mass incarceration? How do we rethink our indictment of the fact that 2 million people are in prison on any given day in the United States? So the book that we're working on, hopefully finishing, is an attempt to answer this last question. I'm only going to be able to give you a brief précis of it, but I'm going to focus on two things. So the first thing I'll do for probably most of the talk is hopefully not most, just half, I'll defend premises 1 and 3 together for you. I'll explain why I think that our standard indictments are wrong. And then that will leave us without an indictment, so I'm going to, since an indictment we must have, I'm going to sketch the indictment that we offer in the book. So let me begin with the first kind of standard indictment that you hear a lot, which is that mass incarceration is a punitive overreaction to harmless behavior. This is perhaps the most common answer, I think, to what's wrong with mass incarceration. It's based on the idea that we have criminalized, particularly in minority communities, the consumption of drugs, which is a behavior that we ignore in white communities. And therefore, America has a high incarceration rate because of the rate at which it incarcerates low-level drug offenders. But in fact, mass incarceration has little to do with the war on drugs, at least directly. Only about 20 to 25% of the jail population are in there for drugs. Only about 5% of that total, that's not on the slide here, but only about 5% of that total are the kinds of offenders that are identified by the conventional story, non-violent, low-level drug offenders with no real ties to the drug trade. And then this graph shows you that the United States, in fact, incarcerates drug prisoners at around the world median, which is another puzzle for the war on drugs story, because if the war on drugs explains mass incarceration, then why don't other places also have mass incarceration? In fact, I submit to you that rates in incarceration in the United States actually have quite a bit to do with the level of violence. So one very simple way to do this is to decompose the incarceration rate into two quantities: the rate of serious crime, here the rate of homicide, and the rate of punishment per homicide. So you can see that the fraction on the left just decomposes into the second and the third. You multiply them together and you get the fraction on the left. Now, just focus your eyes on the present today. Today, you see that the prisoners per homicide ratio in the United States is not that different from the prisoners per homicide ratio in other developed countries. And in fact, earlier in American history, and we can talk more about this in the Q&A, it was even lower than the prisoners per homicide ratio in other countries. So there's something else going on. In short, the point here is just that mass incarceration is not really about the punitive social control of harmless behavior. A second myth that you often hear, I think, or a second indictment that you often hear, is that mass incarceration is wrong because it's undemocratic. One answer you might hear is that mass incarceration was built by an elite in order to control the poor, or maybe a white elite to control the black poor. But I think the difficulty for this answer is that the American criminal justice system is not actually characterized in a cross-national sense by an absence of democracy, but in actual fact, the pervasiveness of democracy. So unlike other European countries, American electorates actually have quite a bit of say in criminal justice outcomes. Juries make some decisions. Judges, prosecutors, some police chiefs are elected or appointed by elected officials, whereas in other countries they're unelected civil servants. Elected officials in state legislatures also have a lot of say over criminal statute. So fitting this also, that's just kind of a static institutional fact, but fitting this, there's a lot of evidence that the punitive turn in public policy tracked a punitive turn in public opinion. This was the subject of a lot of the early work that I did on mass incarceration. So I'll show you a graph from that. It's a little bit of an ugly graph, but we'll try to work through it. So the red and the blue lines here, which say white Americans, black Americans, these are averages or summaries of answers that white and black people were giving in the United States to polls about how punitive they were, basically, whether they supported the death penalty, whether they thought that criminals should be treated more harshly. And it just sort of, this graph fits a trend line through that over the kind of I think the data begin in 1955 to the present. And what you can see is that there was an arc in punitive opinion that doesn't really fit with what the conventional story of why people turned punitive was, which is the conventional story told most powerfully in the New Jim Crow, is that people turned punitive in reaction to the civil rights movement. But in fact, people's punitiveness peaked 25 years after the peak of the civil rights movement, and in fact what you see is it tracks trends in crime much better. Moreover, as James Foreman Jr. has shown in his book, or Michael Javen Fortner has shown in his book, these trends in public opinion characterize not just white Americans, but also black Americans. So it's not wrong because it's undemocratic. It's probably more accurate to say that it was some kind of democratic outcome, which I think is a challenge for theories of why it's wrong that lean on its procedural features, like it's democracy or not. A third indictment that I think you often hear is that mass incarceration is explained by racial bias or racial discrimination. You might think that mass incarceration is wrong because it's the result of many different racially biased or racially discriminatory decisions that are taken by actors inside the criminal justice system. So if we have mass incarceration only because police, prosecutors, judges, juries are behaving in racist ways, then surely mass incarceration is wrong. But the racism inside the criminal justice system, and there is quite a bit of it to be clear, it's only a small part of what explains the total racial disparity inside prisons and thus mass incarceration. Put another way, sometimes I like to explain it in this way. If you turned every police officer, every judge, every juror, and every prosecutor into an anti-racist activist, you would almost certainly still have mass incarceration. Our best evidence suggests that about 70 to 75% of the disparity in rates of incarceration can probably be explained by disparities in crime commission. Here I've just summarized the quote from Michael Tonnery, which is summarizing the literature. He's a famous criminologist. I want to be very clear about what follows from this fact, because I think this is a place where facts and values start to get confused. People tend to be wary of this argument because they think that it justifies racial disparities in punishment. But I want to emphasize that this is to confuse a moral judgment with an empirical fact. It's to make a category error about how to reason about punishment. Observing the fact of racial disparities in criminal offending doesn't commit you to victim blaming or to supporting mass incarceration, much less. To have argued, after all, that racial disparities in offending explain racial disparities in incarceration is actually just to have raised another very important sociological question, which is what explains racial disparities in offending. And here, there's a lot of social science scholarship that offers a good answer. African Americans are more likely to be involved in violence because they live in America's worst, most unsafe neighborhoods at the bottom of its class structure with few legal opportunities to escape. So crime is really just an index of racial oppression. If you accept this argument, it's really difficult, I would say even preposterous, to hold people or racial groups to blame. And it's even more difficult, I think, to go one step further and argue that somehow racial disparities in punishment are justified in some deep sense. But it does mean, for the purposes of what we're after today, that racism, in the sense of racist actors, doesn't furnish an easy answer to what's wrong with mass incarceration either. At least not, again, racism in the sense of individuals inside the criminal justice system. And then the final thing that I think you often hear is the idea that mass incarceration is extremely inefficient. One thing you hear a lot, I think, is that the United States spends an enormous amount of resources locking up offenders, policing American streets, and if we put that money towards education, housing, healthcare, welfare, it would solve all of the problems that prisons and police can't solve. And these kinds of arguments were very common, I think, after defund took off, and they've long been very common in reform circles, where people will point out it costs $40,000 to incarcerate someone, $10,000 to send them to school. These arguments, though, I think are based on a fundamental misunderstanding about social and penal spending in any modern capitalist society. It is true that we spend about $40,000 per prisoner, and in fact sometimes much more than that, and only about $10,000 to $15,000 per kid that we send to elementary school in the United States. But while this fact about per capita expenditure is right, the inference that prisons and police are more expensive is actually wrong. So let me try and explain this. Mass incarceration is not a program for all poor people for all their life. It's hyper-targeted, and that's true of policing as well. It's hyper-targeted. And this hyper-targeted nature of penal policy ends up being really important. Police arrest a small fraction of the public. In the latest poll I looked at, about 15% of Americans report ever having been arrested at least once in their lives. Prosecutors will charge a smaller fraction. Prisons harbor an even smaller fraction of the public. And then second, contact with the criminal justice system, even for those people who do make contact with the criminal justice system, is typically occasional over their life course. It's concentrated in young adulthood and early adulthood, late juvenile years and young adulthood, and it's concentrated further amongst men. Social programs, by contrast, in all democratic capitalist societies, more or less, are indiscriminate in both dimensions. Many of them go to all people, so think of Social Security, Medicare, And if they don't go to all people, they go to all poor people. People living under the poverty line in the United States, about 50 million people, right? So it's already 50 times the number of people inside prison. And further, they go to people for large chunks of their life. Education policy will be spent on people from 0 to 18 or 4 to 18. Unemployment insurance is available throughout your time on the labor market. Retirement income is available once you retire, so on and so forth. So the result of this is that, in fact, U.S. spending on prisons and police is in fact dwarfed by spending on social programs. The United States spends about $300 billion on courts, prisons, and police, spends up to 12 times that on social programs. And if you count just targeted social programs at the poor, it's still around $1 trillion a year, about 4 times more. The point here is just that mass incarceration is in fact kind of crime control on the cheap. That's how I would propose you think about it. And this points, I think, to some of the limits of the kind of defund arguments that we heard, which is that even if you do manage to cut prison and police spending, redirecting that money would not really do very much to fix the inadequacies of the American welfare state. So at least in that kind of conventional sense, mass incarceration cannot be considered inefficient. I am going to argue that it's inefficient in a different sense, but the conventional argument that we're wasting money that could be spent efficiently elsewhere, that's not quite right. Mass incarceration, in fact, should be thought of as a kind of symptom, I think, of the lack of spending in the United States on the poor. So then the question becomes, what's wrong with mass incarceration? You might have your own indictment. These, I think, are the 4 most common indictments. What is wrong with mass incarceration, if not any of these things? The very first draft of the book that Chris and I wrote led with something like the following answer. We argue that a better answer would look something like this. Mass incarceration is explained by serious crime. Serious crime is explained by poverty and inequality. Poverty and inequality is unjust, and therefore mass incarceration is unjust. Now, I think there's something useful about this answer. It conveys the idea, which I think is an essential idea, that the overdevelopment of the American penal state has something to do with the underdevelopment of the American welfare state, or at least a symptom of its sort of unjust basic structure. Mass incarceration is a symptom of things that are wrong with America. But when we taught this class on the book the very first time, our students noted that there was something very strange about this answer, or unsatisfying about this answer, useful as it might be. The inference from premises 1 to 3 to the conclusion was missing something. After all, they noted, something can be a symptom of injustice without itself being unjust. So imagine I came up with this example, and my wife told me it's a bit cutesy, don't use it, but I'm going to try and use it anyway. We'll see whether it works. So imagine, for instance, that a man named Carl is walking along the sidewalk, and he falls into an unjustly uncovered manhole, breaking his leg. He is taken to the ER, where another man named Frederick patches up his leg. The cast that Frederick puts on Carl's leg is a symptom of injustice, since the manhole was unjustly uncovered, but no one would argue that Frederick's casting of Carl's leg is itself unjust. The cast is a symptom of injustice, but it is not itself unjust. So something can be a symptom of injustice without itself being unjust, without being the wrong response to that injustice. That was the challenge that our students put to us when we taught this class. They said, this answer doesn't really work. Now, you might say, and this is what we said the first time they came up with this, that there's something really weird about that analogy, because in fact, mass incarceration seems to be a case where the person responsible for the manhole and the person doing the bandaging are one and the same. So if, in fact, if the person responsible for the manhole and the bandage is one and the same, then maybe the answer does work. But it's important to note that this might not, in fact, be correct as a response to that objection, because in the case of mass incarceration, social policy, or the welfare state, that's really the preserve of the federal government, while penal policy is really the preserve of local and state governments who can't feasibly use social policy. If you're the mayor of Ferguson, you can't tax San Francisco's billionaires to fix the root causes of problems in your area. It's just not possible. So, in fact, the United States is, in some ways, in a position like the original analogy. One way of putting this, the same first 3 premises, is premise 4, only the federal government can address poverty and inequality, but it has not. And then you might say local and state governments have responded to the fallout, which is the rise in crime, the best they could. And you might again then pose the question, therefore, what's wrong with mass incarceration? Most of the book that we've written is a challenge to premise 5. It's a challenge to the idea that, in fact, local and state governments have responded the best they could to federal inaction. Now, to understand our answer, you have to understand one other thing about mass incarceration that I haven't yet explained. People commonly assume that American mass incarceration stands for a generally overdeveloped penal state. But this is not true, in fact. America does have many more prisoners than the rest of the world, but it has about as many police. What this means is that the prisoner to police ratio in the United States is much higher than anywhere else in the developed world. So you see on the y-axis the well-known fact that America has mass incarceration. But then on the x-axis you see the much less well-known fact that America doesn't in fact have nearly as many police as many people think. It has about a middling number of police for a developed country. The significance of this, now you might ask, well, what's the significance of this? Well, I think the significance of this is that one way of summarizing this is to say that the United States leans on what's known as penal severity, which is the severity of what happens to the people who are arrested, rather than penal certainty, which is the probability of someone getting caught if they break the law. So one way of putting this is to say that local and state governments have relied on severity rather than certainty, which is what has given us mass incarceration. Now, severity, I think, imposes greater costs, greater suffering than certainty, and I'm going to substantiate that in a second. And I also want to say severity concentrates that suffering on the least advantage. So why is this the case? Why might you believe premise 2 and premise 3? Well, the first is that premise 2, which is the idea that severity or severity favoring regime is less efficient, this is because a regime which leans on severity is one which imposes great costs for little gain. The great costs are what we've already been talking about, the 2 million people on any given day who languish in American prisons. Little gain, now the little gain part I think might not be as well understood. Little gain is the fact that over and over and over again, empirical social science has taught us that long sentences are really inefficient at reducing crime. They're much less efficient at reducing crime than the probability of sanction. One way of thinking about this is that a person is much more likely to be deterred by a 90% chance of a 1-year sentence than a 10% chance of a 9-year sentence, right? Those are kind of equivalent deterrent outcomes, but behavioral psychology and everything in economics has taught us that short sentences that are certain are much more likely to deter than long sentences that are uncertain. Thus, certainty is much more efficient at reducing crime than severity. And so we argue in the book that a regime that favored certainty is one which would reduce overall suffering substantially, even if the federal government did nothing at all about the enormous poverty that's the root cause of mass incarceration. Now, another point that I want to emphasize is that severity is also much less fair. It denotes a regime in which we impose severe costs on a few people rather than much less severe costs on many people. We live in a criminal justice system in which two things are true. A relatively small proportion of people who break the law get caught, but if you get caught, the penalties are extremely, extremely severe. And this, I think, is profoundly unfair. It asks the least advantaged people, who are the people who are especially likely to get caught, to shoulder the burdens of deterrence. And it's profoundly, I think, unjust. And so we argue that the efficient and fair thing for state and local governments to do would be to rebalance penal policy in line with the way in which the rest of the developed world does it. So to move from a ratio, the Y to X ratio here is kind of the prisoner to police, the severity to certainty ratio, to move from that ratio to this ratio. Now what that would mean in terms of the reduction in the prison population and the increase in police population depends a lot on what the federal government does. If the federal government does nothing at all, then it looks like a radical decrease in the prison population and an increase in the police population. But if the federal government were to aggressively attack the root causes of crime, it could feasibly mean that there would be a reduction both in the prisoner population and in the number of police. A lot of it depends on how optimistic you are about our ability to get our act together and fight the root causes of crime. And I can talk more about that. So let me just summarize. What is wrong with mass incarceration? Well, I was arguing to you that it's a symptom of the injustice of federal inaction. And that tells you something, a symptom of the failure to do something about poverty and inequality. But it is also an unfair and inefficient response by state and local governments to the fact of that inaction. Now, I do want to just register before I end, and this is the last thing I want to say, is that this second part of our answer has already garnered a little bit of controversy and some attention. And I'm very happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. I do want to just address one thing about it. One of the main charges of the argument that we've been making is that it's in some way harmful or dangerous. That to call for more police, even if alongside much, much less incarceration, is to risk causing serious social harm. But of all the things the people have said, this is the one thing that I think has dismayed me about our intellectual culture in reflecting on this reaction. Because the truth is that every argument we make about how we ought to manage the burdens of crime, punishment, and policing is an argument which will impose certain costs in pursuit of certain benefits. All proposals in this 2x2 space, whether you propose to be closer to the origin, whether you propose to be where we are, or whether you propose to end up where we argue you should end up, all of these positions are positions which impose suffering on the least advantaged. The task really is to figure out what is the point that would impose the least possible suffering. The point of saying that is that I think the stakes, in other words, are just really, really high. They're high whether you're defending something like defund, they're high whether you're defending the status quo, and they're high whether you're defending the position I defend. And my commitment remains the same as the commitment that I felt when I was in the EPI classroom last summer. In a world of such high stakes, I want us to use all of the tools of our craft to understand what we can do to minimize and more equally distribute the suffering we impose, which is right now borne so severely and so disproportionately by the least well-off people in our society, by the racially disenfranchised and racially oppressed populations in our society in particular. And this is not an easy task. This is a really difficult task. I think we're in this space right now, in the space of thinking about criminal justice policy, too content with some very easy answers that don't bear out, in my opinion. So I think it's not an easy task, it's a difficult task, and it's a task which we have to approach with the kind of seriousness that you'll see in the essays upstairs and I felt in the classroom that I was in last summer. Thank you.
John, do you prefer speaking for the lectern or for the... Okay, maybe we'll all join
Sit back.
you then. The floor is yours. John Eason.
I want to thank Joanne for putting this together, and I want to recognize and acknowledge students from my urban sociology course here, as well as the IAPA senior seminar. Given what's already been presented, I had a couple of different options on presenting today, but I think I'm at the risk of possibly flopping. I'm gonna go with some recent writing. I may refer back to some of my earlier work. I've published a lot on not just a book, Big House on the Prairie, Rise of the Rural Ghetto and Prison Proliferation. I've published a fair amount on what I refer to as the prison boom. That's the tripling of facilities in the U.S. from 1970 to 2000, more than tripling of facilities. And the key thing that I'm working around now with some NSF funding, National Science Foundation funding, is looking at the relationship between the prison boom and mass incarceration in particular. A lot of the standard story goes that we were overcrowded, and that's why we built prisons. I actually have some preliminary analyses showing that because 83% of prisons were built by states, that we built our way into mass incarceration. So states that build prisons see a rise in their rate of incarceration at the state level. So we built it, and we built it, and then we filled it, right? So the standard story is a little different. But I'm going to start inspired by some writing by my good friend Reuben Miller, who talks about the gift of proximity. So the second book I'm writing now is called Bringing Down the Big House, from the raw deal to transformative justice. So these are some musings that I've been journaling about, writing about for about the last year in terms of where we are in this, in the fight to reduce our over-reliance on mass incarceration. But Reuben Miller also points to something he calls the supervised society. There are 5 times as many people who are under supervision as there are under lock and key any day, right? There are so many more people who are under supervision, and that's tied to a whole other ecology of inequality, not just people, poor black and brown people who live in disadvantaged communities, but also a whole system that depends on them, right? This goes beyond police. This is parole and the whole criminal punishment system. So I want to start with this question. Bringing Down the Big House begins with a very simple question. Why must my brother be locked up for my sister to have a job? Black folks are at least as likely to know someone who works for the so-called criminal justice system as we are to know victims, clients, residents, or people traditionally labeled as inmates. These simple facts force us to reevaluate what the great Richard Pryor once said about prisons. When you go down there looking for justice, that's what you'll find, just us. Not only are we the oppressed as we suffer disproportionate incarceration, but we are also agents of the oppressor as we are overrepresented in policing, corrections, and across the entire punishment system. My family is no different. Despite personally facing severe poverty, every one of my 6 siblings was born in Tree City, USA, Evanston, Illinois, and attended some of the finest public schools in an uber-white liberal space. Despite the privileges provided in this space, we were not protected from the reach of the penal state, as every one of them has been detained and arrested. In fact, my oldest brother, a former Chicago police officer, spent several months in prison. My fictive sister, Jackie, was a basketball standout middle school, but her career was derailed by severe GI illnesses in high school. She has Crohn's disease. She garnered national attention early on, receiving invitations from top women's college basketball programs across the country. However, by the time she was ready to go to college, only Eastern Illinois University left an option for her. Early on, she was hearing from Stanford, USC, Penn, a lot of places that had great women's basketball programs and a great education for her. She played a few years until her failing health and surgeries drove her off the team. She graduated, took a job as a social worker, but soon after left for policing as the Lutheran Social Service closed its doors, lacking funding. She worked there for 2 weeks, showed up, there was a sign on the door saying, "We've closed," right? This is important because today in the U.S., there are 700,000 social workers, and there are nearly twice as many police and corrections officers. As the first black police officer in Highland Park, she enjoyed excellent health care coverage, and she will soon retire after 20 years of serving on the police force. So she's part of my adopted family. She's part of the family that adopted me when I was in middle school, and providing a home as my living situation proved unstable, having been evicted twice. They supported me from middle school through my graduate career at the University of Chicago. As a researcher and recovering community organizer, I couldn't get could get on my high horse and stand in judgment condemning her life choices as blue fever. But if your best option, right, you try to work as a social worker, that job shuts down. Given the historical discrimination African Americans face in the legacy of discrimination we face in the labor market, we've been forced more and more into the government and public sector jobs, with those jobs increasingly shrinking, but the share of those jobs increasing in the criminal legal system. This provided a great on-ramp for her to enter the black middle class. Now, if you consider this, the public sector, not just policing, not just being a corrections officer, is a great alternative for many African Americans to make it into the black middle class. So this is part of the issue with how we've assessed mass incarceration and how we talk about it today. When we talk about abolition and not speak of transformative justice policies that can remake the communities, fundamentally remake the communities that African Americans inhabit. Black people have been historically made to deny our families in order to save ourselves. To support yourself, do you have to eat your brother? Saidiya Hartman, the eminent scholar of transatlantic slavery, put it best. Africans did not sell their brothers and sisters into slavery. They sold strangers, those outside the web of kin and clan relationships, foreigners and barbarians, lawbreakers expelled from society. In order to portray your race, you first have to imagine yourself as one, she says. These realities challenge the boundaries of the linked fate of the black community, and this is a very common political science term, linked fate. What that means is basically there's the belief that especially those black folks that have made it to the middle class have a responsibility to help out poorer black people make it ahead. So what does it mean to be black? Who wins? Who loses? Why are black families and communities offered such poor choices? Choices that pit family members at odds against each other for survival. We are not only locked up by the state, but we are also agents of the state. So again, why must my brother be locked up for my sister to have a job? Given the protections of civil service careers, black folks have been overrepresented in these jobs for years. These jobs, as they increase in punishment, it should come as no surprise that there is twice as many corrections and police officers as there are social workers. Again, just hitting on that point again. I want to skip ahead because I want to save time for Q&A. With 6 of 10 Americans knowing someone that has suffered from the pangs of imprisonment, the U.S. prison system is undeniably ubiquitous. While the prison reaches most, it's omnipresent in the lives of black people, with 8 of 10 of us knowing someone who has been imprisoned. Right? And so the New Deal, while the New Deal was a public works project that brought much needed infrastructure to most communities, employing millions of Americans and providing a pathway from poverty to the middle class, the Raw Deal, what I'm calling the Raw Deal, this expansion of black workers in the criminal legal system, specifically the prison boom, because it's a public works project. We went from about 500 prisons to over 1,600 in 30 years. These are disproportionately built in communities of color, rural southern communities that have higher proportions of African Americans and Latinos, as Ed said in the opening, right? My first book lays that out. This Raw Deal, right? Why are we given these choices to either get a job or become a job? Right, so these are the musings, these are the things I'm trying to tease out as I write this second book. The prison boom both warehouses us while simultaneously offering black rural towns a means of survival by improving their reputation and providing a stalwart for economic development. The stark irony here is that the prison, through mass incarceration and mass supervision, has ruined so many black lives in neighborhoods, whether rural or urban, while simultaneously providing a ballast to rural communities of color, teetering on the edge of economic, social, and political death. By looking across my own family, I'll illuminate the contradictions and the narratives of linked fate Black people share, those espoused in the work of Locking of our own, James Foreman Jr. I have numerous family members serving as parole and probation officers, these real and fictive kin, right? And a variety of other law enforcement roles. I'll draw on these interviews as well as a host of data, including every prison ever opened and closed, geocoded in U.S. Census place over time. I can trace back to, I have papers looking at the relationship between historical racial regimes, counties that had their proportion slave in 1860, and whether or not they built a private or public prison. I have a host of quantitative questions I'm answering while also weaving together this narrative to focus on, to reframe the conversation, this current conversation on criminal legal system reform, on communities that I think will play a huge role in our often forgotten rural communities of color. So I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both for those fantastic comments. We're going to open it up in just a moment, but I wanted to ask you both a question, and I'm trying to figure out some way to articulate this in a sophisticated fashion, but I can't, so I'm going to articulate it in an unsophisticated fashion. When you hear each other speak, do you feel that the other is essentially making the same argument or a very different argument? Because you're both challenging my understanding of the conventional explanation for mass incarceration in the United States. But I'm curious whether you feel the other is challenging in the same way or in a different way.
You go first.
I go first?
Yeah, you go first.
I think that there is a profound amount of overlap in the answers, but I don't want you to take responsibility for the parts of the answer that you don't like. But I just think both answers, from what I heard you say just right now, emphasize that this society doesn't do enough to attack the root causes of the problems that we're dealing with in the form of mass incarceration. So when you were saying that we have 600,000 or 700,000 social workers and 1.4 million police officers and corrections officers, that's a symptom of the same thing. It's a symptom of our inattention to the root causes of these problems. Maybe where we would depart is in the idea that I think as social scientists should have something really powerful and utopian to say as well, which I take this project to be. But I think also increasingly I've become keen on having something to say about what we should do in dystopia, because I think also our choice of dystopia is a bad choice. I think we're choosing between dystopias, but we're choosing poorly, I suppose.
So can you, I'm sorry, can you restate that? Are you saying we're choosing different
dystopias?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is all bad. It's just what version of bad is it going to be?
What version of less bad is the best we can do? But not the best we can do writ large, but the best that I think in particular state and local governments can do. Because state and local governments have such a limited set of tools at their disposal. I think the kind of project that you're outlining, as I was saying, is a project for the federal government. It's a project for something like a Marshall Plan, a New Deal, something like that, and I profoundly believe in that. But I also think that we live in a political economic conjuncture where for the next 20, 30 years, I think that unfortunately just seems to me like a pipe dream. And so I think there's also something better we can do at the state and local government than let state and local governments manage the fallout of that failure the way that they've been managing it.
All right, we're going to come back to you. Go ahead, John.
You're killing the children's spirit. They're all like, there's a bunch of
That's my
abolitionists.
job,
That's your job, to kill their spirit. No, you do not get to, no. So I actually, so there's being your vantage point and I think your critique of the federal, we do have a lot of overlap, but we're approaching this from completely different angles. While this is this is an early draft of the intro to the book, the class I'm teaching focuses on a prison closure. We're actually interviewing a town. We're interviewing business owners that the state of California identified who would be most impacted by a closure in Susanville. So I triangulate data and I try and keep it at the meso level, right? I try and look at place-based approach. So while I'm talking about big macro stuff, the answers I think John Pfaff's some of your arguments overlap, and I know probably originate from his, but his empirical evidence is not, I don't think, is as tightly knit as yours is together, and it doesn't have the extension of the policy implications, and that's where I think we see more eye to eye. And I don't think there's a policy prescription, right? I've been toying with the idea of a Green New Deal, but there isn't a policy prescription because there are 50 states. This point Pfaff makes really powerfully. There are 50 states, and there's 3,000 counties, and there's over 2,700 municipalities. There isn't a criminal legal system. You could say there's a criminal justice, criminal punishment, call it what you want to, as much as you could say there's a healthcare system in this country. There is no healthcare. There's anybody tried to see their primary, secondary? There's no one system, right? You got to sort of sort out and sift through a bunch of mess. And that's why we pay so much for healthcare. This isn't just about our criminal legal system. This is about our healthcare. This is about how we operate. And so you're right about this being a dystopia. And that's actually the folks who are living in dystopia live in these highly disadvantaged communities. So in Big House on the Prairie, I wrote about them having the towns that want a prison because they demand a prison. It is the best of the worst option available. They're already there. They already are living on the edge and about to die because the communities around them are dying. And so, I think how we're going to reverse this trend is the bigger question, and that isn't just federal policy. That is state, local, and county policy as well.
Can I just ask one more, then we'll open it up, but just to make sure, sorry, this is solipsistic in a way, just to make sure I understand. Donner, would I be right in saying that you're arguing that mass incarceration is in some sense an artifact of poverty and of social policy that's not addressing poverty and that's tolerating inequality? And John, you seem to be saying something a little different. I mean, agreeing with that, but you're saying that that the demand side for incarceration suggests that it's not just that mass incarceration isn't just an artifact of poverty, but it's something to do with some culturally bound something in our repertoire, that the solution to poverty becomes incarceration rather than God knows what other things could be done at either the federal or the local level. And it feels like a little bit, they're both dystopic, but I'm sorry to say, John, yours is even more, if I could put it.
Mine is more depressing than his.
Yeah, sorry, I shouldn't say that. I shouldn't make
me?
invidious where I pit my friends against each other,
No,
but
no,
rather
no.
that there's something about the demand side also, like that's the best or primary or only solution we have. Then that undercuts the idea that, all right, we solve poverty and then mass incarceration is addressed.
Yeah. I would want to say that in some ways, actually, I think we're both arguing that it's a necessary but not sufficient condition for mass incarceration, if that makes sense. So in my view, it's necessary, not sufficient, because I think even in a world in which we have these deep pockets of poverty, it's possible to imagine state and local governments reacting to them differently in a way that meant that we wouldn't have 2 million people in prison. So that's the sense in which I think for me it's not sufficient. But I think it's not sufficient for you in another sense, which is that I think you do think that if we could break this paradigm, we could, in fact, respond differently to it. Is that fair?
That's fair. I'm trying to project some hope.
Yeah.
Right? Because otherwise, what are we doing? Right? That's
but do you feel like our job is to be hopeful where there isn't grounds for hope?
So I come at this from a whole different I came at this as an abolitionist, and
Yeah.
then I met social science. I met like the reality. I was like, oh, right, and not just in the form of
Yeah.
quantitative, not just doing
Sure.
an analysis and looking where prisons were built, but then I went and talked to black people in rural communities that were like, no, we went to prison. I was like, are you sure? You sure you wanted to? Yes, we wanted to prison. When the head of the NAACP was like,
Wow.
yes, we wanted to prison. I was like, this is the first week in the field. So this is not just my, 5,000-foot quantitative analysis. This is on the ground.
Yeah.
So if people's minds can be made up where they think this is a good idea, I have to have some faith in humanity. Maybe not in my lifetime, right? I think I'm a little older than you. I got gray. You don't. So
Very young,
I don't know if in my lifetime, I don't see how the fact that we don't even realize what I just said in this room. Nobody knows that we built our way into mass incarceration. If you look up the national academies, what they do every year for the causes and the collateral consequences of mass imprisonment, the causes and what caused it, and what are the consequences, never do they have anything on prison building. Yeah. Never do they have anything on that. And thinking about rural communities in particular. So we don't even know, we're just assessing the problem. There's like the fact that this work, what seems like common sense stuff, what I'm doing, even what you're doing, it seems like this is the problem with sociology. This is what I say to my students. It seems like the science of the obvious. No one's asked this question before. And no one's asked this question before, the stuff you're showing. So the fact that there's inquiry in this area provides me with a little bit of hope, right? Otherwise, I don't know. I think I'm hoping that the 20-year-old me that wanted to go out and shut down every prison, the one that's, at least there's a conversation about it now. Mm-hmm. When I was 20, it was like, why would we do that, right? So we've made huge advances in terms of our culture. That's so you're right about the conjuncture, but I have to have a little bit of hope that if we keep chipping away, I don't think abolition's like a snap your fingers is all. And it's not even about abolition as much as it is about rethinking how we're going to treat the least of these. Mm-hmm. And that's where I am. I was depressed after I wrote. You may be are you in the middle of your book or at the end?
Well, that's a really rude question.
Yeah, I know. I'm asking you that because you could be in both places at the same time, right?
Yeah, I think that's where we are.
Yeah, and I got really depressed. Yeah. Uber depressed for 2 years because I was like, oh, I know this. Nobody else knows this. And I don't see how we're going to fix this. That's where I was about 5 or 6 years ago. I was like, there's no hope here.
And then the kids gave you hope.
Yeah, the kids gave me hope. Yeah. The younger, well, yeah. I'm not insulting you guys. I literally have children their age, so that's why I'm saying the kids. They're literally, yeah. So you're in a spot. I know that's an uber rude question about the book, but yeah, you're in a spot where that means if you've really hit a wall and you're like, I don't know what to do about this. That's where I was 5 or 6 years ago because you're in a conversation by yourself.
Wow, giving me a lot to think about. Let's open it up. This is just terrific. Questions in the room? Yes. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh.
Hi, yes.
A former student of mine.
Oh, maybe.
Yeah.
Great. If you just wait for the mic. Perfect. Thank you.
Oh, fancy. Hello. I have a quick question. So I'm wondering what you both think the role in both of your theories and your work, what you think the role or the importance of the education system, the public education system is. I guess, I don't know if I've actually talked much, even though I've known Adana for a while. I don't know if we've actually talked about this specifically. Obviously, I know that you're both, as am I, but both proponents of more social spending, more investment in those communities, obviously. But I'm talking more about like the penal side of things, like how from like a young age, little children, and particularly like as we all know, black and brown kids are really sort of criminalized and suspended and expelled and whatever. And so it seems like all of this starts from a really young age. So I'm wondering what you both think the role of those sorts of policies are. Like, would your solutions or utopia, or, or well, I don't know if we're talking about, utopia or not, but would your proposed solutions involve changes to the way that, black fourth graders, if any fourth graders, but the way black fourth graders, for example, or sixth graders, whatever, are disproportionately suspended or expelled, would your solutions target that too? Yeah.
Thanks.
Are we collecting or are we answering straight away?
Yeah, let's go
Straight
one
away?
at a
One
time.
at a time?
Yeah.
Do you want to go first?
You can go first. for this
Okay.
one.
Well, actually, Gabe, I think I'd probably like to ask you that question because Gabe is about to be a middle school teacher, and so I'd like to hear what you think. My own view is that I think there are kinds of the problems with schools maybe could be bucketed into two buckets. One is a problem of, as you said earlier, inadequate funding. And that problem, I think, there's been quite a bit of progress over the last 2-3 decades in addressing that problem through these state redistributive schemes that you're very well aware of. But then the second bucket of problems, I think, is the other bucket that you alluded to, which is that the education system is porous, and a lot of the problems in the education system are going to be symptoms of the problem outside the education system and problems with broader conditions of poverty and stuff outside the school. And so I do think that there are changes. Maybe the best way of putting this is that they're kind of interdependent. There are changes to the education system that would help alleviate problems outside, but there are also problems inside schools that couldn't be addressed properly without addressing the problems outside. And so I would hope that some of the either utopian, dystopian solutions would alleviate some of the problems in schools, because I think some of the problems in schools are, you're right, symptoms of the problems outside.
I'm going to punt and say you should talk to John Diamond in Annenberg. I do a little bit on the school-to-prison pipeline, but even that term I find a little problematic because there's, schools are inherently pro-social, but I'm also a black father who sued a school district. Mm-hmm. So in Texas for how they were treating my children. Mm. So that's just cards on the table. So I don't have good, there are school abolitionists. I don't exactly agree with that, like burn the school down. But I'm still trying to recover from that stuff, right? So as a teacher, I hope you're mindful of your pedagogy and you've been properly trained to be attentive, not just to issues around race and racism, but sexuality, gender, all of those things, food insecurity, all of those things, like the service work, the emotional labor that is going to take for you as a worker in that system, right? You are like that, but no one is going to, I hate to be hokey about this. We valorize police. We put all of these other folks like we really are loving them, and we crap on teachers. And that's actually come up into higher ed as well now, right? Where we're being devalued as well. So I hope you can stick in it as long as you can to figure out some answers for us, because I don't want to pretend like I know enough about that.
You definitely didn't punt on that.
I did?
That was not a punt.
I screen pass. Screen pass.
Thanks. I saw we have Margaret, and then we'll get to you. Margaret, go ahead.
Hi, thank you both for really, really fascinating talks. I wanted to ask Adonis.
Margaret, can you use the mic just behind you?
sorry.
Thanks.
I wanted to ask Adonis. Is this on? Tech support. I wanted to ask Adonis something. Your talk ends with the idea that we need more policing so that we can bring down incarceration rates and we can look more like Finland and those other countries. And what I wanted to say is, don't you also need an argument about how we need to change policing? Because you know, the United States is very different from Finland and all those historically homogeneous European countries and our history of policing and everything. So you know, your argument is challenging.
Yeah,
But
of
I
course.
think if you're going to make it, you
Yeah.
really have to,
Totally.
address what is policing about.
Yeah.
So,
Great question. Yeah. So I think the way the way I presented it suggested that the evidence for more police, less incarceration comes from that cross-national comparison. But in fact, the way that the argument is defended in the book is by using our best empirical estimates about what happens when you put more police on the streets and what happens when you cut sentence lengths and cut incarceration. So the proposal, just to clarify, because I don't know if it was clear, if we don't do anything about poverty, we propose cutting sentence lengths by 80 to 90% and expanding the police force by about 50%. And the reason that fact that it comes from empirical estimates, not these cross-national comparisons, but from empirical estimates inside the United States is relevant is precisely because I think it addresses at least partway your objection, which is that we have lots of good evidence now over the last 20, 30 years about what happens when you put police on the streets, and it has some very positive effects, which is that crime goes down, and it has some very negative effects, which is surveillance and arrests goes up. And so there's this very, very challenging trade-off that one faces, which is in how do you weigh the benefits of less crime, and I should say also less incarceration, because the proposal is to cut sentence lengths. How do you weigh the benefits of that against the costs of more surveillance and more arrests? And the arrests, the most recent papers on this suggest, interestingly, that it's the kinds of arrests that would increase are the kinds of petty arrests for petty offenses that are sort of police discovering offenses where they didn't know offenses existed before. The incidence of serious arrests, which are where a lot of police abuse and violence concentrates, the suggestion is that that actually goes down if you add police, because the main way in which police deter crime is not by arresting and apprehending people, by just being scarecrows, basically. And so I think some of the question that you're answering can't be adequately answered because we don't have good empirical estimates on the relationship between police numbers and the most egregious uses of police force, like police killing. But we do have good estimates on the other things, the other kinds of harms that police cause. And I would say, if all I was saying was we should be like Finland, that would be inadequate to answer your question. But I think we have lots of evidence from inside the United States on how this changes.
Yeah, sure.
Do I need the mic? I
Yeah.
can speak pretty loud, but.
It's for YouTube, right?
Okay,
Yeah, for
perfect.
recording.
Just want to follow up. So I do want to follow up with that line of questioning because like hearing that kind of jarred me a little bit. Like,
Of course, yeah, it's jarring.
Yeah. And what I do know is that if we do increase policing, it's going to disproportionately affect Black and brown folk.
That's right.
And that's what my main concern is with that. And then, sorry, I'm going to like ramble a little bit because I had a lot of notes because what you were saying was like very interesting and engaging. And so you also mentioned something about redirecting funds will not be are fixing a lot of these social ills, but does it also take into account the fact that a lot of our social welfare programs are penalized, right? Like
Penal.
Waquan,
You mean like they're
Yeah.
penal in nature?
yes,
Yeah.
they're penal in nature, right? Like Waquan talks about this. We have a lot of scholars that kind of note
Yeah.
how a lot of these things operate. And so I'm kind of worried, especially in the contentious environment that we're currently living in, that somebody's going to see this argument and just take it at face value and not actually really see like the nuances that you just brought up in answering our question and how that's going to cause more issues for people that are actually trying to combat mass incarceration, hyper-policing, and the racialized nature of these things. And I guess how do you plan to kind of account for that? Because we as scholars, we can't just put things out there haphazardly because it can have very real repercussions for the people that we're trying to protect.
Great question. Oh, I was waiting for the microphone, sorry. I think, so let me try and address your excellent question in order. So the first thing I think that you said that's really important is that the burdens of more police are going to be borne by the most disadvantaged people, as you put it, the least of us. That's who we care about. That's the only thing that I really care about is what is the condition of the least of us. That's the challenge of penal policy. But the reason it's a challenge of penal policy is because the burdens of policing are borne by the least of us, but it's also the case that the burdens of incarceration are borne by the least of us, and the burdens of crime are borne by the least of us. I mean, black men make 55% of people who are killed in any given year are black, right? And that's an extraordinary burden as well. And so the question here really is not settled by observing that the costs are going to be borne by the least of us. The question is, what's the way that we could minimize in total the costs that the least of us bear? That's the challenge that we try to set ourselves in the book. And one reason to be a little bit more optimistic about policing relative to these other harms is that policing, in fact, is in some ways the form of penal policy that burdens the least of us the least disproportionately. So one way to think about that is that of people who are, I wish I had the graph up, of people who are arrested in any given year, about, I can't remember, we can look at the graph, but it's about 11 to 12% of them who are arrested for, in any given year are black. Actually, sorry, the statistic is someone who have ever been arrested in their life. It's about proportionate to the population. Someone arrested for a serious or petty arrest, it's about 20 to 30% of the population. But people in prison, that's 40% of them are black. People killed in homicide, that's 55% of them are black. So there's some reason to think that, in fact, policing distributes the burdens less disproportionately and less unfairly. And the reason for that is what I was trying to say earlier, which is that right now what we have is we have a criminal justice system or a criminal legal system that puts all of the burdens of deterrence on the people that it catches. But it doesn't catch many people. So, I was looking at these numbers earlier because I was thinking of a vivid example for a question like yours. We have, in any given year, there are about 600,000 robberies. In total, admissions to prison, there are about maybe 50,000 in any given year for robbery. So we catch about 1 out of every 12 people who break the law for robbery. But what we do is we sentence that one person who goes to prison, we throw the book at them, and we give them an enormously long sentence. And that, I think, is profoundly unfair. The other thing I think that more policing does is it's uncomfortable for people who are middle class and rich, because those people don't really bear the burdens of crime. They don't bear the burdens of incarceration, but they don't want police hassling them on the streets. And so in some ways, I think it's actually the least disproportionately burdening of the three. That's at least the contention.
Did you want to comment at all, John?
So there's a senior scholar, Darnell Hawkins, who did work on this years ago. He's black, and he was looking at black homicide, right? And I don't know if he concluded the same thing as policing, but I don't know that he'd necessarily be against that, given the fact that black homicide is the nature of it, right? The way it's structured. And he really studies how place and how the nature of black homicide is structured. So policy is, where the sausage is made, and no one's going to like this. A good policy means that it's actually, no one likes it, right? If it could prove effective. A lot of sides will be contentious, but if it's effective, they'll only like a policy after it's been implemented and done. But I think we all agree something has to be done, right? And more police may not be the answer itself, but the type of policing we get will be a little different. And I think in support of Adonar's point, I don't know if anyone's seen the Joyce Foundation report right after, it was in 2020, 2021, it was a report on support for police funding, right, by race. And guess who supports police funding by race? Black people. Black people support police funding. Guess why? We are the police. If you go to New York, there's I think Fortner's has a master's student who just showed that black women are the fastest growing proportion of officers in the NYPD. If you look at the top 5 or 10 cities in the U.S., who's actually being employed? It's black people. In the latest mayoral race in Chicago, it was basically the cops versus the teachers, right? And race was huge in that because it was black cops versus black teachers in a city that's racially divided 3 ways. So this is not going to be easy. Hopefully you don't get in too much trouble behind this, but yeah.
Sir, you had a question.
I didn't answer your second. We'll talk about it.
Well, there's time. We'll come around.
We'll
But
come back to
when
it,
you-
yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was interested in having him answer that second question.
Well, maybe.
Go ahead. No, go ahead and
No,
answer.
I'll wait. I'll talk to you after.
All right, so, I don't know if this,
Are you
this
Matt-
mic
are
on?
you
There
Matt?
you go.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm Matt Hudson, and I'm from Emerson, the EPI, and this is an interesting topic because I am someone who have served a lot of time behind the walls, 33 years, and most of which was for an unlawful conviction. And as I sit and listen to the arguments and I listen to what both of you guys have proposed in various different instances, I can't help but to notice that one thing that's really inextricable to the argument itself, but the way that you two kind of coin it is kind of like separate from what has already been, what the discussions are already been in and around these subjects matters. And one is, how do you parse what we know, which is that most of this, like let's take for your example, you add more police, but you don't deal with the real issue of the racial hierarchy that's in place and what that produces as a consequence to those black and brown communities, right? And because that's not addressed, no matter, Finland may not be battling this type of argument, reality over here, but we are every single day. And where men and women are unlawfully sent to prison by, white folks who are investigating these crimes. Now, and I heard the brothers say that, we are increasingly becoming the police, but that is not the case in Boston, Massachusetts. And just as it's not the case in other cities, right, where this component is not addressed. And then when I think in terms of black men, it's kind of going back to what Naim Akbar said in his book, In the Psychology of Changes of Slavery, is that you have people who become inextricably linked. Blacks become inextricably linked to the system to such a degree that in order to be fair to the white person, they think that they have to come down harder. So what they do is they perpetuate the same failed practices and policies in those communities. Now, with that said, I'm kind of wondering, how do you address that? That's my question for you in your argument. My question for you, brother, is that listening to your argument it almost sounds like to me, listening to with what's the sister's name in her book?
Kaba?
No, but she kind of hinted on that also. But what we know about reasons why prisons were built.
Oh, Gilmore. Well, we think we know.
Okay.
That's what I'm gonna tell you.
Okay.
Because
So-
folks don't have data.
So let's look at that, because I think some of those symptoms are, when we look at what happened with NAFTA, when we look at all those economic realities, right, that really put us in, and I say us as the U.S., in an economic situation in which the majority of white folks was looking for replacements of a lot of those industrial jobs being shut down, lost, and what have you, right? It seems like there isn't a and of course, I haven't read your material, so I'm interested, and so I'm getting a little presumptuous here, but it seems to me that you don't kind of address that in your argument, right? When you talk about why black folks are wanting these prisons, right? Nor the psychology behind.
I got a whole book out there on the table.
Thanks.
Okay.
Why don't,
Yeah.
John, you want to go first, and then Adon?
I will go real briefly.
Go ahead.
The reason why we built like 1,100 plus prisons in 30 years, the economic argument falls short. The arguments that are made are, oh, it was white people in rural communities that want jobs. If you look at the communities that actually built prison, the probability of getting a prison increases as you have more black and Latinx folks in it, right? So around 66% is the optimal percentage of black folks in a town. So that means poor rural communities. So over 60% of prisons were built in rural communities, many of them in the South. That means they're way blacker, right? Those communities are way blacker. They have high levels of disadvantage, a lot of poor people, a lot of public housing, right? So the structural forces from NAFTA and all of that are mediated by what's going on at the state and local policies. And I show that in the first book. So I'm taking that came out in 2017. I finished my dissertation in 2008. I've been in a this is why I'm saying to you, I've been in a conversation with myself for like 20 years on this. There's again a popular notion of why we think we built all these prisons, and I can just say go check the data on this. Even the way the theories that have been developed, I have more recent work showing that many of the theories that Ruthie Gilmore developed, they really don't explain what's going on in California, because their book is only about California, and they for sure don't explain what's going on in the rest of the U.S. California is in the top 5 builder of prisons. Oklahoma built more prisons than California, okay? So New York, not a top 5 prison builder. We built these prisons in rural communities in the South. So the story, the national story, even the local story in California, that's why I'm in Susanville now, trying to figure out how to responsibly close a prison, right, and reduce demand. We haven't addressed demand, right? Why do rural communities want them? And they want prisons not for economic reasons, but as a form of reputation management. So you got to ask yourself, how bad is your community look if you think a prison's going to improve it? If you haven't been in the rural South, you heard about the dirty South, you listen to Outkast, you listen to Rick Ross, he's rapped about being a CO. I'm gonna have that in my he's rapped about why he would do it again. He would do it again, he says. Right?
Yeah.
So
Like I said, I'd like to read you.
Yeah.
Thanks. Donner.
So I think you asked a really powerful question. What I would say is that I think of the argument I'm making as an attempt to reckon with exactly what you're describing so eloquently, which is that we have a problem that is the legacy of the kind of both mentality and history that you were describing, which is that we have a problem of immense poverty and inequality that's extremely concentrated racially, disproportionately. And the question is, with the policy tools at our disposal, what is it that we should do about that? This is, I think, a challenge of dealing with racism and racial inequality. That is the central challenge. That's how I think about this policy challenge. Then I think the second challenge in what you said is, okay, it's a problem. The racism affects the problem, but I think what you were saying very powerfully is that racism might also affect the way in which the solution gets implemented, right? And I think that's a real challenge, and that's a difficulty. But I think one reason that I was responding to your question by saying that we use evidence only from the United States is precisely because of this concern, because American police are not like Finnish police. They're not like English police even. They're American police. And so what we need is empirical evidence about what happens when you either add or remove them and what happens when you cut sentence lengths in the United States. Those are the two levers that we have to deal with this mess unless the federal government does something. And so that's why I think the relevant evidence that is a little robust to your objection is just evidence from the United States.
But it still depends on people, right? Who
Totally does,
who
yeah.
are raised into these ideologies.
Absolutely.
And that's my main concern.
Totally. And that's
how do you separate that it's inextricable? You can't separate
Totally,
those
totally.
things. So then how does that become a solution? I mean,
Well, just in the sense that what we have is evidence from the past 20, 30 years about what's happened when we have added people exactly like this to the streets, when we have added police, what's happened, when we have cut prisons or increased prison sentences, what's happened. So the evidence comes from those people. Those people, I think you're totally right, are mired in this ideology. But those are the only tools we have, I think. Because one possible implication of what you're saying is, well, then we just, we're working with these people and these people are hopeless and there's nothing we can do. But I don't believe exactly that. I'm not that hopeless.
no, I think there's something you do, but I think
It's
that's
different, yeah.
right.
Sure.
We're pretty much reaching the end. In fact, we've gone a little bit over. So that's my fault. But maybe I'll suggest the following. Joanne, am I right that there's a reception just outside? So just upstairs on the second floor, there's a reception. This has been a great conversation, but if you can stay, and if you guys can stay a few minutes, we can continue the conversation in a relaxed. I'm sorry?
Read Mac's essay.
Absolutely. And read Mac's essays and those of others upstairs. So let me bring this session to a close. But before I do so, let me thank you all for your questions, but especially let me thank Adana Usmani and John Easton. You know, we talked about dystopia, and there's plenty dystopic aspects, of course, of this topic. But I have to believe that there's hope in knowledge, and that there's no hope in ignorance. So I thank you both for enlightening all of us today. Thanks.